presentation tonight in a more traditional fashion. And I want to quote from the French post-colonial scholar Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. Ontology, once it is finally admitted as leaving existence by the wayside, it does not permit us to understand the being of the black man. For not only must he be black, he must be black in relations to the white man. Some critics will take it on themselves to remind us that this proposition has a converse. I say this is false. The black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man, for overnight, the Negro has been given two frames of reference in which he had to place himself. And of course, ages ago, the philosopher, African-American philosopher and theorist W.E. Du Bois named this the double consciousness. Okay, so I will start my lecture. In this lecture, I want to focus on the peculiarity of Michael Jackson's racial identification by drawing from W.E. Du Bois's double consciousness and what Fanon reveals as the doubling of identity, functioning as a conceited manifestation of the self in the other, which represents a form of racial liminality. This alignment of a constructed and constructing self, or the two-ness, as Du Bois called it, leads to the following question. What does it mean to be black in America? In this discussion, this question is answered through the theoretical lens of Fanon, black skin, white mask. Like all blacks in America, Jackson has difficulties in developing his sense of self in a culture that normalizes whiteness as an ontological neutral category and uphold the subject as raceless and unmarked. Normalized whiteness has created an identity crisis for Jackson that invites a negative reading and also fluid famous comments such as weird, or as the tabloid nicknamed the singer, Wacko Jacko. In fact, weirdness in the face of blackness should be subject to the most excessive form of derision, because blackness constructs a body that is already defiant of social norm. Given that the construction of blackness relies on an absolute contempt for the lived complexity of blackness and is always reduced to an authentic otherness, Jackson's identification process as a variation, a deviation, and a spacing in relation to racial classification is far from simple. Jackson's desire to anchor himself in racial particularity, neither black nor white, is not dominated by a longing to undo blackness and retrieve towards whiteness, but towards a form of racial ambiguity. Jackson's simultaneous performance and resistance to impose racial definitions serve as an impasse between blackness and whiteness, which is locked in a symbiotic relationship of subordination, blackness, and domination, whiteness. Yet Jackson's racial in-betweenness still signals blackness, and he continues to be seen through what Fanon calls corporeal malediction of his unavoidable blackness. Hence, like every black person in America, Jackson must live the colored line, the racial divide, which bear witness to the existential dilemma that inhabits the very core of his sense of self. Identity is associated with norms of identification, including blacks, women, and homosexual, which assimilate individuals into social groups. An identity determines how a person belonging to an ascribed group should be treated. In this respect, the remorseless attempt to construct the category Black has certain implications for racial identification. Because Blackness is measured against whiteness and is reduced to otherness, it is difficult for a Black person to develop a solid sense of self. As we see with Jackson, racial identification becomes a deeply ambivalent and fragmented process, which for the most part leads to the fragmentation of identity into an infinitesimal plural identity, to use Diane Fossey's phrase. Or what Omi Baba refers to as a third space, a liminal space of ambivalence in which I see Jackson as a racialized subject being discursively confined. And now I will like to talk about Blackness and Black identity. Even though Blackness is surrounded by mythical and stereotypical expectation that preoccupy the collective imagination, what it means to be Black in America has certain racial implications. In fact, the essentialization of Blackness, which is fundamental for the representation of identity and the politics of difference, is a fixated projection of a distinctively white intervention, where Blackness as a device can purify the impure, straying brothers and sisters, as Strothal puts it. However, as Jackson has shown, Blacks' racial identity can never be fixed. Yet once Black identity is fixed, we treat it as if it was genetics, and as such, it is constantly policed. Because Blackness guarantees the status of whiteness, indeed, the aura of an authentic Blackness feeds a special kind of comfort in America. Notwithstanding some common cultural particularities that make Blacks authentically Black. For example, there is a Black way of singing and dancing. And as the African-American philosopher Anthony Appiah points out, this putative authenticity screams out for recognition. Authentic Blackness, which means that Blacks have to adopt and assimilate to the valued practice of the norms of Blackness, is another way of undermining Blacks' noticeable univocality. And it is precisely for this reason that what constitutes a Black identity for Cornel West explicitly rests on an homogenizing impulse that assumes that all Black people are really alike, hence obliterating differences such as class, gender, sexuality, and so on. Drawing on West's observation, Bell Hooks assert that there is the assumption that there is a Black essence shaping all African American experience. And if this is the case, then the fundamental complicatedness is that those elements that remain unique and particular to Blacks as individuals have to be concealed or denied. Why Blackness, for the most part, is wrought by a preeminence of whiteness, and it is constantly shaped and reshaped by a dominant white identity, Blacks are trapped within the dialectics of performing whiteness on the other hand and resisting whiteness on the other hand. Of performing whiteness on one hand and resisting whiteness on the other hand. Consequently, racial self-identification develops into a pathological condition in which Black subjectivity becomes subjugated by a gaze that is directed through the epitheme of whiteness. This experience of subjugation leads to the identity crisis and a misidentification where the self and other have become implicated. The subject hence becomes an unsettled agent in between sameness, whiteness, and otherness, blackness. This in-betweenness is experienced first as corporal, the material foundation of one's social and subjective continuation. The experience of Jackson is the perfect illustration of this condition, where his image starts and ends viciously disjointed. In this disjointedness, according to African-American philosopher George Yancey, one ceases to experience one's identity from a locus of self-definition and begins to experience one's identity from a locus of internally imposed meaning. In other words, one is forever in combat with one's own image as the essential other of whiteness, aptly analogous to John Paul Sartre's articulation that it was the anti-Semite that fashioned the Jews and Simone de Beauvoir understanding of white women as the indispensable other of white men. This is what is referred to as the order of otherness, to use Omi Baba's phrase. Given that whiteness can exist only as the imminent possibility of blackness, as its assumed opposite, inferior, unnatural, impure, whiteness alone, as Toni Morrison cautions, is mute, meaningless, unfathomable, pointless, frozen, vile, curtailed, dreaded, senseless, and implacable. Blacks are held in prison by the overall power of whiteness, manifesting itself in two opposite directions, either outdoing or undoing blackness, that is performatively acted out. Jackson and his quandary of identity, besides demonstrating the problematics of self-identification for Blacks in America, provides a useful starting point to analyze the preeminence of whiteness and how it has constructed blackness. While the Black self is an infraction of a constructed other, it is constantly interrogated, policed, and subverted. A Black person is persistently, to use the title of one of the tracks from Jackson's album, Bad, a man in the mirror, haunted by a self that is persistently constituted and reconstituted by the tenacity of the white gaze that does not see Blacks as equal to themselves. Hence, it is important for whites to position themselves as different from Blacks. White projects what Diane Foss explains as identification alienation effect onto Blacks who are enjoined to identify and to disidentify simultaneously with whites, to assimilate but not to incorporate. to approximate, but not to displace. Racial identification in this respect carries an ontological and epistemological valence, such that the question, who or what I am, becomes a question of being and knowing, a question of desire. The Black self is defamiliarized and reconstituted within the discourse of race, which draws our attention to an identifiable source of power, safeguarding and replacing racial distinctions. The question then, what it means to invoke race as a social concept organizing Blacks' identification is fundamental, because Blackness subjects individual to an identity that is marked on the body. Consequently, a Black person in America has difficulty in developing his or her sense of self, because the body is surrounded by an atmosphere of antagonism, which comes with an implicit knowledge about the Black body that has non-liberating effect. One of the repercussions is an ambivalent self-identification, a denial of the self. With remarkable insistence, this knowledge is insightfully described by Jackson in his song, I Can't Help It, in which he has this to say: I look in my mirror and it took me by surprise. I can't help it if I wanted to. This identification provides for a radical reading of identity formation, which reflects Jackson's identity as solely representational, consequently alienating him from the self. With Jackson, what we see is a kind of self-ordering in relation to the dominant norm of race construction, another form of otherness within the other, a sort of racial ambiguity, neither Black nor white, a kind of postmodern racial subject as the only possible self. In fact, Judith Butler recognizes the disruption of the other at the heart of the self is the very condition of the self's possibility. So this possible self symbolizes one thought of what one ought to be and what one is fearful of becoming. Jackson's life is a good demonstration of this possible self, which is revealed on his body, not Black or white, woman or man, heterosexual or homosexual, consistent with his claim, I wouldn't help it even if I could. Jackson does not see his representation as an awkward or deliberate failure. According to Fox, whenever he appeared in public, say on stage for Motown 25, on television with Oprah Winfrey for their momentous interview, in Monte Carlo at the 1993 World Music Awards, his history is recounted through video imagery, reconfirming that his body is the site of a visible identity, an effect of erasure, repetition, and resurrection. It is indeed a body that is discursively constructed and deconstructed, culturally imposed and refuted, and undoubtedly bounded by the corporeal malediction, as Fanon calls it, of his inescapable otherness buried deep within his Blackness. Now I would like to talk about Jackson and racial identification. Jackson is positioned on the borderline between the self and the other. The ambivalent self-identification, or in this case, this identification of the subject from himself, is the consequence of a perverse uncertainty between opposite identities, unnatural, natural, black, white, woman, man, mother, father, homosexual, heterosexual metric. Is Jackson an other? Diane Foss defined others as subjects who do not fit into the rigid boundary definition of dissimilitude, or who indeed may be left out of the self-other binary altogether. Because of Jackson's severe redundancy of artifactual otherness that is made possible through skin bleaching, hair straightening, and countless plastic surgery, I want to suggest that he's an other. Drawing from Butler's notion of gender performativity in bodies that matter on the discursive limit of sex to a non-normative construction of sexuality as queer performativity, the non-normative construction of Jackson's race identity can be seen as race performativity, which become ratified and realized through repetitive performativity and daily acts. Jackson disquieting racial ambiguity has sincerely been marked as a postmodern and post-human. There is no real Jackson. Elizabeth Taylor once compared him to E.T. because of their mutual alienness, their distance from the planet Earth, their ambiguous sex. In the Thriller video, Jackson is a werewolf. In Smooth Criminal, he's a RoboCop-like metallic figure. Jackson also appeared as a 30-foot tall stature in his 1995 promotional video for his story. Journalistic commentators and cultural critics refer to him as what Gil Deleuze and Felix Guattari call a body without organ. A text that is discussed and debated with a postmodernist flair, which as a result reads non-being, non-human. Indeed, even if blacks want to be human, they are positioned in such a way that they are constantly dehumanized. In fact, if blacks are seen as human, they can go beyond the boundary of race, and like whites, they can be viewed as raceless. Sadly, in the end, blacks are not, in the Morrison words, worthy to be treated as whites. It makes sense then that specific epistemology, ideologies, and practices are in place to systematically sanction and protect white privilege. Jackson is determined to break away from the wretched construction of blackness as a sign of deficiency, disapproval, and lack. Instead, he forges a form of identity that goes against constructed blackness. However, blacks cannot escape America's practice of physical identity formation, and forever confronted by what W.E. Du Bois in The Soul of Black Folk described as a peculiar sensation. This doubling of identity, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of other, shaping black subjectivity as mixed up and fragmented. And as a result, this fragmentation, inner, outer, self, other, Jackson seemingly appear as a body without organ, which for the masses is not normal. In fact, that which is normal is inevitably natural, and it becomes the source of truth. This emphasis on naturality is another way to transform the subject or social being in what Judith Revel referred to as a new instrument of control. Jackson's appearance deconstructs and challenges the corporal notion of natural bodies and fixed identities as prearranged and controlled. It is exactly for this reason that Jackson must be resisted, restricted, or worse, punished and humiliated in order for society to safeguard the realm of normality. Indeed, Jackson must be normalized. In an effort to normalize Jackson, the police brazenly photographed and displayed his penis as a part of the evidence in the alleged child molestation charges against Jackson. Jackson's penis stands for the alleged crime scene, unlike hair samples, fingerprints, or human tissue that can serve toward crime and the crime. And even though child molestation is a serious issue in the United States, it cannot be treated as something separate and apart from the laws and the institutions that control and define race, gender, and sexuality norms. For instance, in his work, a Foucaultian genealogical reading of whiteness, the African-American philosopher George Yancey explores how members of a society are trained to perceive themselves as having a certain sexual nature through the deployment of theories and practice that define that nature and so determine the realms of the normal and the abnormal. Yet we must be cautious of the operation of truths about sexuality that control and stigmatize the racialized body as basically a sex being. With the media coverage of Jackson's child molestation charges, where his penis is treated as evidence, morality and ethics are transformed in a provocative forum of a familiar Black racial aesthetics. Displaying Jackson's penis in order to humiliate him recasts the focus on child molestation to Black masculinity within the framework of heteronormativity and the larger racial discourse concerning the sexuality of Black men as a threat to white social body. The mythical norm of the Black penis plays into white's fear, vulnerability, and hypersensitivity of the imaginary danger of Black masculinity. In Michel Cunha Martinique, Cunha goes to the heart of the issue. Quoting Cunha, Frantz Fanon writes, "The Black man's sword is a sword. When he has thrust it into your wife, she has really felt something. It is a revelation. It is the charms that it has left your little toy is lost. For Negroes, with their penises exposed, would fill a cathedral. They would be unable to leave the building until their erection has subsided. And in such a close quarter, that would not be a simple matter. the penis is a metaphoric substitute for the black man. As Fanon explains, one is no longer aware of the Negro, but only of a penis. He is a penis, and he is constantly in danger of literal as well as symbolic castration. In America, to use Fanon's title of chapter 5 in Black Skin, White Mask, the lived experience of black, is one dislocation from the self, split by the black skin, white mask. For this reason, a black man suffers in his body quite differently from the white man. The harrowing inscription of race on the body make it difficult for a black person to construct a solid and secure sense of self. For this reason, the development of a sense of self for the black subject is never physiological, but always cultural. Because black identity is culturally inscribed on his or her body. Strothall writes, "It is one thing to position a subject or a set of people as the other of a dominant discourse. It is quite another thing to subject them to that kind of knowledge, not only as a matter of imposed knowledge and domination by the power of inner compulsion and subject confirmation of the norm. In the end, for the marginalized like Jackson, coming to terms with the existential dilemma of self-definition becomes problematical. The outcome is always looking at oneself through the eyes of the culturally constructed white gaze. This gaze forces upon a black person an unusual weight, which can lead to a pathological behavior, as the multiple plastic surgeries that Jackson underwent attest. What he can hope for as best is a pseudo-recognition, a white mask. In fact, this is the trick of whiteness as structured in everyday life. As Yancey has shown, it is to give the appearance of fixity, where the look of the white subject interpolates the black subject as inferior, which in turn bars the black subject from seeing him or herself without the internalization of the white gaze. Hence, the black body has to police and regulate itself because it has internalized the white gaze. In other words, blacks are saddled with a peculiar sensation, a double consciousness, always viewing themselves through the white gaze, or as Strothall puts it, with an inner compulsion and subjective confirmation to whiteness. To sum up, a black man who entertains the very possibility of crossing over racial boundaries must be policed at whatever cost. Fanon's analysis in The Wretched of the Earth and Michel Foucault's In Discipline and Punish on how the body, the state, and violence are linked correspond with America's history of institutionalized violence, which counted on men to kill some white people to keep them white, and to kill many black people to keep them black. At the moment when the biology of race as a foundation for racial knowledge has been attacked from the left through the discourse of race as a social construction, and the right through the discourse of colorblindness, fixing the truth of race on the body is fundamental. Even though Jackson's skin become whiter, less ebony, more ivory, less ebony, more ivory. As Michael Awkward put it is too simple to argue that he was unfixing race on the body. In fact, there are many blacks that pass for white. However, while Bellows, the black feminist, has rightfully located blacks' desire for lighter skin as a result of racist imagination and a colonized mindset, today passing is no longer about looking white. It is about getting a license for entry into honorary whiteness. Yet it does unfortunately requires freeing oneself from the labels associated with blackness and adopting a way of life that permits for the association of white images, presenting oneself or being presented to white society in a way that make whites feel protected and inaccessible. It is like joining a private club. Once you have become a member, you must put up with the rules. Consequently, even if Jackson passes for white, he needs to adhere to a specific form of whiteness, which unremittingly accompanies the interior whitening process. Whiteness, in this sense, does not stand apart from the exterior inscription of whiteness upon the body. For this reason, a poor white person learns the attitudes and behavior that are tied to whiteness as a fundamental defining signifier of white supremacy. In the end, even if Jackson is savaging his African physical features, as Greg Tate's "I Am White, What's Wrong with Michael Jackson" notes, Jackson's skin become whiter. The outside transformation from black to white cannot be considered transformative of an unavoidable script of a particular morphological body that is considered as black. And as the journalist of Washington Post says is best, a black man is still a black man underneath it all, no matter where life takes you, even if that man is Michael Jackson. For Jackson, having a black identity is important. We use identities to construct our lives. Identity provides a nexus for memberships into groups based on race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, disability, religious prescription. Even those people are making up identities, even though people are making up identities all the time, gay and punk, Jackson, in an interview with Oprah Winfrey on February 10, 1993, stated, "I'm a black American. I'm proud to be a black American. I'm proud of my race." However, an emphasis being placed here on black American reads split subjectivity, black and American, two souls in one dark body, as W.E. Du Bois explained it. For Jackson, even though he acknowledges his pride in being black, in songs like Black and White, it is not about him conforming his racial identity, but about refusing the constraints of identification in racial terms. "I am tired of this stuff. I'm not going to spend my life being a color," he acknowledges. In the end, he merely begs society not to black or white him. These words read as Jackson's intimation to move beyond race, because race is, as Jackson claimed, where your blood comes from. In this sense, he is a slave to racial normalcy and cultural inscription, but to his own sense of his racial identity as different, non-identical, and non-identitary. Even though what constitutes a Black identity is never fixed, he is considered a traitor to his race, as is expressed by several tabloids. Indeed, in Jackson's quest to transcend racial boundaries, he is the precise embodiment of James Weldon Johnson, ex-colored man, a liminal figure, living on the margins of racial normalcy, neither black nor white, the embodiment of a fragmented self, fractured and dislocated repeatedly. I'll talk a little bit about Jackson and his fragmented self. In his childhood, Michael Jackson is described by Corbina Mercer as a cute child, dressed in gaudy flower power gears and sporting a huge Afro hairstyle. Now he has become, as a young man, a paragon of racial and sexual identity that as intoxicated his distractor. According to Silberman, he intoxicates his critic to a large degree that they presume that they can step outside their expertise or their discipline and act like legal scholar, counselors, and clinical psychologists. Despite his showy style, Michael Jackson remains something of an enigma. On stage with one of his sequins jumpsuit is a flamboyant picture of grace, a sleek jaguar ready to pounce. In photographs, he's a creature of sweet sexuality, beguiling, angelic, androgynous. In person, though, he is quiet and reserved, a goggling young man of cagey reticence with a childlike aura of wonder. The polymorphous ambiguity of Jackson, as Ern puts it, demonstrate a maze of narrative all running in complex and different direction, which is often simplified as weird. How does Jackson's weirdness challenge identification as well as misidentification? The doubling of otherness informing his race and gender self-alienation? Does his weirdness anchored in being not black or white, man or woman, create anxiety because it can be positioned in a framework of meaning and subjectivity as sites for interrogation and subversion? It is to Jackson's weirdness that I would like to redirect our attention. In what follows, I want to locate his weirdness within a framework of identification. Identification as a desired accomplishment is never achieved. What it does is unnerve the self. Jackson's numerous plastic surgery can be interpreted as a denial of his Black identity, a way to reconfigure what Stone Quest, borrowing from Robert E. Parks called the marginal man, caught up in the meta-language of race. The marginal man is living and sharing intimately in the cultural life and traditions of two people. One is Black and the other is white. Blacks in America live with this contradiction. Jackson, for one, is incapable of convincing himself that he's not white, unwilling to accept the harsh consequences of being Black in a racist society. Instead, he relegates himself to moving between racial spaces. In a white world, the Black man is bad and dangerous. Fanon explained that in the unconscious, Black equals ugliness, sin, darkness, immorality. Paradoxically, Ruth Frankenberg argued that whites, on the other hand, see themselves as on race and just human. Hence, whites have the misanthropic audacity to bolster the meaning of the human. In the white imaginary, to be Black and human is impossible. Black and human are paradoxical terms. There is a particular racial etiquette, a particular performance of Blackness that has to measure up to whiteness and thus is reduced to otherness. A Black man is made aware of his or her condition as a second-class status through what Fanon labels an implicit knowledge of systemic racial inequality, such as racial profiling. In this regard, we can follow Fanon's logic that for Blacks, the unconscious is non-existence. Since the racial drama is played out in the open, the Black man has no time to make it unconscious. His feelings of inferiority are always conscious and not repressed in the Freudian sense of repression. However, how this consciousness, implicit knowledge, is played out become important. For one, Blacks are not free from the trauma that accompanies such knowledge. W.E. Du Bois, for once, understand the souls of Black folk. What is often a Black soul is a white man artifact, Fanon conclude. Living in a society that is marked by whiteness, Jackson, like all Blacks in America, is split into this two-ness, an inner and outer being, the Black skin and white mask. To use the word of Gordon, he is outside there without an inside, an object in the midst of other objects, experiencing is being through others, and is caged in by an overpowering subjectivity, begs the question that Du Bois asks in the souls of Black folk: how does it feel to be the problem? To contemplate this issue, I must return to the African-American philosopher George Yancey. When Blacks are asked the same question by white Americans, the relation of being Black and being a problem is non-contingent. It is a necessary relation. Outgrowing this ontological state of being a problem is believed impossible. Hence, when regarding one's existence as problematic, temporality is frozen. One is forever a problem. However, it is important to note that it is from the white imaginary that this question how does it feel to be the problem is given birth. In other words, blacks are not the problem. The problem is the propensity to construct blacks as the problem. Blacks cannot break away from the objective frame of power and its authoritarian dimension, which is exercised on the lived reality of their daily life. Jackson, for one, wants to rid himself of the stigma of color, to become what dialecticians term an absolute being, a being that stands in the way of human being, or a human way of being. I will now conclude this paper, or this lecture. In this lecture, I draw on the problematics of an essentialized blackness and the specific implications that are associated with blackness in an attempt to provide particular insights into racial identification. Given that blacks experience their being through a normalized whiteness, identification becomes a pathological condition, a melancholia, a perversion, which inadvertently takes on an unusual form of racial identification. Jackson's racial identification is related to the other cultural representation of alterity that implicates him as being weird. His preoccupation with racial and gender in-betweenness, not black or white, man or woman, and otherness within the other, a body that is unrepresentative but yet signals blackness, has promoted anxiety among the masses. As Judith Butler reminds us, some modes of appearances for category, such as race, are marked, and some are unmarked, which means that some stand out, such as blackness, as a visible social sign, whereas whiteness, which is no less social, is nevertheless part of the taken for granted visual field, a sign of its presumptive hegemony. Thank you very much.